More than 10 fighters were killed in Borno, not by the military, but by other terrorist groups fighting themselves. That detail is important. In the Lake Chad area, two rival factions, linked to ISWAP and Boko Haram, turned their weapons on each other. The clash lasted for hours and happened very close to Nigeria's border with Niger. This kind of fighting is not random. When extremist groups start killing one another, it usually means something has shifted inside their camps. Sometimes it signals competition for territory. Other times it shows internal weakness, pressure, or leadership struggles. The real issue here is not just that terrorists died. It is what this renewed rivalry tells us about the current state of insurgency in Borno and the Lake Chad Basin. So the key question we need to examine is this: why are terrorist groups in Borno turning on each other now, and what does it mean for security in the region? Here's what has been confirmed from available reports. On Tuesday, a violent clash broke out between two rival terrorist factions operating in Borno State. The groups involved were fighters linked to ISWAP and the Bukura faction loyal to Abu Umima, a breakaway group associated with Boko Haram. The fighting took place around Dogon Chiku Buhari village in Abadan local government area of Borno State. This area lies along the Lake Chad Basin axis, very close to the Nigeria-Niger border. According to security sources, the Bukura faction, believed to be operating from settlements on the Niger Republic side of the border, crossed over and attacked ISWAP elements based on the Nigerian side. The clash reportedly lasted for several hours and resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, with more than 10 fighters confirmed dead. The fighting also spread across nearby locations, including areas east of Tuba Moda and along the Bosso Difa axis in Niger Republic. Tuba Moda is located east of Malam Fatori, a region that has remained a frequent flashpoint for extremist activity. These are the confirmed facts of what happened. The deeper meaning comes from understanding why this clash occurred. To understand this clash properly, timing is important. The fighting happened on Tuesday, after months of sustained military pressure on insurgent groups operating around the Lake Chad Basin. In recent weeks, security forces in Nigeria and neighboring countries have continued operations aimed at restricting movement and supply routes in this region. The clash took place in a border area close to Nigeria's boundary with Niger. These border zones are often used by extremist groups to move fighters, hide supplies, and avoid direct confrontation with security forces. What stands out is that this was not a sudden ambush. The fighting reportedly lasted for several hours, suggesting a planned confrontation rather than an accidental encounter. It also happened in an area that has been a repeated flashpoint for extremist activity, including Malam Fatori and surrounding communities. This shows that rival groups are still competing over the same strategic locations. In conflict situations, timing like this often signals internal pressure. When space becomes limited and movement is restricted, rival factions are more likely to turn on each other. This timing helps explain why the clash may be more than just another violent incident. At first glance, this looks like just another violent clash between armed groups. But the real issue here is not the number of fighters killed. The deeper issue is that terrorist groups in Borno are openly fighting each other again. When extremist groups turn their weapons on one another, it usually points to internal stress. This can be caused by pressure from security operations, loss of territory, leadership disputes, or competition over limited resources. In this case, ISWAP and the Bukura faction are operating in the same border environment, where movement is tight and control matters. As space becomes smaller, rivalry becomes sharper. These kinds of clashes often mean that unity within extremist groups is weakening. Instead of focusing on external attacks, they begin to fight over survival, influence, and relevance. This does not mean the threat has disappeared, but it does suggest that the balance within these groups is changing. So the key issue is not simply that terrorists were killed by other terrorists. It is that pressure and rivalry are reshaping how these groups operate in the Lake Chad region. The first group affected by this clash is the local communities around Abadan and the Lake Chad Basin. Whenever rival armed groups fight in border areas, civilians face increased risk, even if they are not the direct target. Next are the security forces operating in the region. Clashes between rival extremist groups can create unpredictable situations, changing movement patterns and increasing the risk of spillover violence into nearby towns and villages. The government and security agencies are also affected. On one hand, rivalry between terrorist groups can weaken them. On the other hand, it can make the situation more complex as groups fragment and act independently. There is also an impact on regional security, especially along the Nigeria-Niger border. Because these groups operate across borders, violence on one side can quickly affect neighboring countries. Finally, the terrorist groups themselves are affected. Fighting among themselves drains fighters, resources, and trust within their ranks. It shows that internal divisions are deepening, even as they try to remain relevant. In this situation, power is not just about weapons. It is about who controls territory, movement, and loyalty in a shrinking and contested space. Beyond the reports of the clash, there are important details that are not clearly explained. One key gap is what triggered this specific attack. While rivalry between ISWAP and other factions is known, there is little public information about the immediate cause of this confrontation. Another issue is how long this rivalry has been building. We are told the groups fought for hours, but there is limited insight into whether tensions had been rising quietly before the clash. There is also little clarity on how this fighting affects control of territory. It is not yet clear whether one group gained ground, lost ground, or simply withdrew after suffering losses. In addition, there is limited information about civilian impact in nearby communities. Border areas often have civilians moving across for trade and daily life, but their situation is rarely explained after such clashes. These gaps do not mean conclusions should be rushed, but they do show that the full picture of what is happening inside these groups remains incomplete. In security matters, missing details often matter as much as confirmed facts. For people living in Borno and other parts of the Northeast, clashes like this add to an already difficult situation. When rival terrorist groups fight each other, it does not automatically mean safety for civilians. In fact, it can increase danger because fighters may move unpredictably, cross into villages, or retaliate against anyone they suspect of supporting the other side. Border communities are especially vulnerable. Many people in these areas depend on cross-border movement for farming, fishing, and trade. Violence between armed groups disrupts daily life and makes movement more dangerous. There is also the issue of fear and uncertainty. When people hear that extremist groups are fighting again in familiar locations, it reinforces the feeling that the conflict is far from over. For Nigerians outside the Northeast, incidents like this are reminders that insecurity in one region can still affect the whole country, whether through displacement, economic strain, or increased security spending. What ordinary Nigerians want most is stability. Clashes like this show that while some progress may be happening, the situation remains fragile. Going forward, there are a few important things Nigerians should pay attention to. First is whether this rivalry continues or spreads. If clashes between ISWAP and other factions happen more often, it could signal deeper fractures within extremist groups operating in the Lake Chad Basin. Second is movement across borders. Because this clash happened very close to the Nigeria-Niger border, any increase in cross-border attacks or movement will be a key warning sign. Another thing to watch is how security forces respond to these internal fights. Do they take advantage of the divisions, or do the groups regroup and adapt quickly? There is also the issue of civilian safety. In the coming days, reports from nearby communities will show whether civilians were displaced or affected by the fighting. Finally, Nigerians should watch for patterns, not single incidents. One clash alone does not define the situation, but repeated fighting in the same areas often points to a bigger shift. These signs will help show whether this rivalry weakens the groups involved or creates new security challenges. This clash between rival terrorist groups in Borno is not just about fighters killing each other. It is a sign that pressure, rivalry, and internal divisions are shaping how these groups now operate. While internal fighting can weaken extremist groups, it can also make the situation more unpredictable for civilians living nearby. Groups under pressure often act out of desperation, and that can create new risks. What this incident shows is that the conflict in the Lake Chad region is changing, not ending. The players remain dangerous, even as they struggle among themselves. So the key question Nigerians should keep in mind is this. As terrorist groups fight each other, will this reduce the threat or simply change how and where the next violence appears? That is the question that will matter in the days ahead.